Welcome back, everybody. As you know, it's the time of the Deleuze panel with Alison and Mercedes. But as I said, Mercedes will speak at the end of the day. For now, I'm pleased to introduce Alison Parks from Hunter College, City University of New York. Parks earned their PhD in political science from the CUNY Graduate Center, is an adjunct instructor at Hunter College. Their dissertation project, Beyond Pathology, Specters of Suicide in the Queer Community, was funded by the American Association of University Women American Dissertation Fellowship, and explores the psychic effects of a life haunted by proximity to suicide. Alison, we are ready to listen to the presentation Line of Flight, Suicide, Deleuze, and Contemporary Power Relations. We are looking forward to listening to your presentation.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's been really interesting to get to hear all of the other presentations because my work is in political theory and auto-theorizing. So I don't really get a chance to engage very rigorously with the more philosophical conversations about suicide. So my paper, I've retitled it to Lines of Flight, the Deterritorialization of Gilles Deleuze. And I guess I'll just start. So Lines of Flight, the Deterritorialization of Gilles Deleuze. Epigraph 1. Young people today walk a fine line indeed between a persistent temptation to commit suicide and the birth of a certain form of political consciousness peculiar to prison. Unsigned, 1973. Epigraph 2. Write, form a rhizome, increase your territory by deterritorialization, extend the line of flight to the point where it becomes an abstract machine covering the entire plane of consistency. Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, A Thousand Plateaus. In his essay, The Simplest of Pleasures, published for the first time in 1979 in the French rag Guépier, Michel Foucault, colleague, friend, and contemporary of philosopher Gilles Deleuze, implores the lovers of humanity who really want to see a decrease in the number of suicides to stop asking why after the fact and to support those suicides undertaken with forethought, quietly and without wavering. He writes, quote, "The people who survive those who have died by suicide see suicide as nothing but superficial traces, solitude, awkwardness, and unanswered cries. These people can't help but ask, why? The only question about death that shouldn't be asked. Why? Because I wanted to." End quote. He further hypothesizes that one reason for the so-called suicide spiral of his time is that people are too depressed by the nasty things forced upon someone who's aspiring suicide, from police intervention, involuntary commitment, stigmatization, etc., that they rush into the act by any means necessary before they've had a chance to really think things through. I argue that while some attempts have been made to address the oppressive nature of such interventions against the suicidal subject, Foucault's hypothesis continues to ring true in Western society today. Since 2020, I have lost one friend to suicide and have seen friends and students hospitalized, voluntary and involuntary, after suicide attempts and other mental health crises. I have never had to ask why. I know what it is like to desperately wish you were dead, to inventory items you have on hand and weigh the potential lethality of their misuse. Anyone who has ever wanted to die knows the answer to why. In the case of French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, the question of why feels even less relevant. He died by suicide at the age of 70. One could say he lived a long, full life. According to his obituary in the New York Times, he died by suicide in the face of a worsening chronic respiratory illness for which he had undergone a tracheotomy. In its most recent 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, the American Psychiatric Association recognizes that suicides undertaken in cases of painful or terminal illnesses may occur free from any underlying pathological conditions. And in some places across the United States and around the world, Deleuze would have been able to seek a physician-assisted death given his prognosis. Thus, one may argue that according to the ableist neoliberal rationality that dictates our time, that he was facing a life, quote unquote, no longer worth living, and that his suicide was therefore rational. Finally, there is the fact that Deleuze simply believed in the world and wanted to be in it. To avoid giving into what Deleuze referred to as the masochistic impulses of the academic, and in alignment with his critique that the scholarly need to read countercultural authors and to find in them, quote, anguish, solitude, guilt, the drama of the unconscious, the whole tragedy of the interior, is revealing of our own decadence and degeneracy. In this text, I instead turn to the work of Deleuze to seek out the ways in which his theorizing may offer tools or comfort to those grappling with a pull towards suicide. I argue that especially within his conceptualization of rhizomatic lines of flight with Felix Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus, as well as within 3 posthumously published volumes that offer further elaboration of this relationship between life and his philosophy, Deleuze makes space for suicide as an exit from contemporary power relations. By offering the suicidal subjectivity opportunities for not being and for contextualizing feelings of madness, Deleuze offers tools for self-analysis that enable one to work through feelings of suicidality without being stigmatized or pathologized. Lines of flight. Writing on the letters of a prisoner known as HM, Deleuze and the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons assert that, quote, young people today, in 1972, walk a fine line indeed between a persistent temptation to suicide and the birth of a certain form of a political consciousness peculiar to prison. They describe that within his letters, HM writes of a desire to flee from the police, from the prison, from the country, and from himself, an interior flight theoretically achievable within the walls of the prison cell. His last mode of escape and his ultimate choice is suicide. Faced with the relentless foreclosure of all other avenues, suicide remained his only option. To conclude their piece, the group writes, a specific number of people are directly and personally responsible for the death of HM. Zooming out from the prison to the social conditions of life under capitalism more broadly, an applicable gesture given prisons as a location where exercises of power are most on display and concentrated, but certainly not exclusive to its walls, I turn to the situation of the youth cited above and their quote unquote persistent temptation to suicide, and argue that similar to the young people of 1972, today's young people are experiencing a similar ambivalence. In the case of the prisoner HM, it is clear that there were external forces affecting his psyche and driving his subjectivity towards suicide. When the lines of flight are cut off, when access to one's interiority is restricted or forcibly altered, existence itself becomes deadened and repressed. The experience of a life is stripped of its intensity. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari enumerate the principles of the rhizome. In nature, a rhizome is a subterranean stem. Bulbs and tubers are rhizomes. The rhizome is multiplicity. It is, quote, made only of lines of segmentarity and stratification, and lines of flight and deterritorialization. In the realm of political resistance, this feature of the rhizome is imperative as it is through these lines of flight and through deterritorialization that the rhizome creates and forms new groups, and each of these new becomings brings about the deterritorialization of the one term and the reterritorialization of the other. The two becomings interlink and form relays and a circulation of intensities, pushing the deterritorialization even further. Rhizomes are liberatory. Revolutions happen when multiple lines of flight converge and take on a new collective nature. Yet there is always a risk of a rhizome being overcoded, reorganized, restratified, and resignified relative to old structures. Under capitalism, this danger is especially great. While all social systems have their own lines of flight, capitalism is unique to the extent that lines of flight are the very conditions of its operations. Deleuze states, capitalism is founded on a generalized decoding of every flow, flows of wealth, flows of labor, flows of language, flows of art, etc. It did not create any code, it created a kind of accounting, and axiomatics of expanding of decoded flow as the basis of its economy. It ligatures points of escape and moves ahead. It is always expanding its borders, pushing them back once more. End quote. In other words, capitalism creates a system into which individuals can connect their desiring machines. These connections produce new desires in an infinite loop that cannot exist outside of the social field in which it is produced. Liberatory thought becomes increasingly difficult, though not impossible, as the limits of the system are constantly displaced and recoded. Deleuze and Guattari had hope. Right, they urged, form a rhizome, increase your territory by deterritorialization, extend the line of flight to the point where it becomes an abstract machine covering the entire plane of consistency. Deleuze believed that even under the conditions of social life, one could remain optimistic and invent new ways of life for oneself, ways of life that provided a protective shield from the pressures of everyday existence. Unfortunately, for the young people of the 21st century, it seems even more difficult to remain optimistic as Deleuze did, given the new era of expanded neoliberalism and hypermedia, characterized by scholar Amani Perry as a time wherein, quote, experience and identity are frequently displaced onto simulacra. Following Deleuze's tendency toward literalization, it is fair to say that in the current moment, living in society means being plugged in at every moment, as social media is co-opted by algorithms and advertising. Our desiring machines are firing and looping at speeds previously unknown, worked into overdrive to the point where, quote, where, to quote Perry, sociality itself is flattened. The self becomes simulacra, engendering feelings of isolation and collective neuroses. In Jean Baudrillard's work on simulacra, he writes that in the virtual terrain, quote, the territory no longer precedes the map, nor does it survive. It is nevertheless the map that precedes the territory, procession of simulacra that engenders territory. In other words, the curation of our attention, our psyches and our subjectivities is being controlled by external forces from the moment of our participation, voluntary or not. Rhizomatic formations, according to their principles of cartography and decalcomania, are, quote, not amendable to any structural or generative model, and thus seemingly offer a mode of resistance to these forces. Through lines of flight and deterritorialization, the map can theoretically be withdrawn, still bringing together the various pieces that managed to survive their initial mapping. But as Perry points out, while capitalism has always moved to strangle lines of flight, and rhizomes always risk co-optation, the neoliberalism of our present moment is fast, integrating the appearance of counter-hegemony at lightning speed. What does that mean for those of us living in its grips? An increasing sense of futures foreclosed, an increasing rate of suicide, especially for those belonging to marginalized groups whose futures are also at risk of being cut off by the violence imposed by white supremacist colonialist logics. When one feels that lines of flight are foreclosed, when the fear of deterritorializing only to experience a black hole where other lines of connection ought to or could be, little hope is left, and the flight becomes one of destruction, abolition, pure and simple. Understanding suicide in this context is thus neither existential nor indicative of some death drive inhabiting our consciousness. It is just another avenue. What does such an understanding of suicide offer? What does it mean to exist with a perpetual temptation towards suicide? And what can the political thought of Deleuze offer as a balm against such tendencies? Building intensity and deterritorializing the other. And in the full manuscript, I go on a sidebar here to talk about the ways in which, as a philosopher who died by suicide, many people have attempted to theorize the death of Deleuze within the context of his philosophy, but that's not my project. I care more about his life preceding that and how his philosophy can be used as a guide toward life. So building intensity and deterritorializing the interior. Writing the paper for this conference was my first attempt at producing something new after a long COVID-19 / post-dissertation hiatus. The process of writing has led to multiple new ideas, including the ability to finally begin putting form to a piece of writing that was conceived rhizomatically nearly 5 years ago, spurred by a seemingly throwaway remark made by one of its members. While the nature of that rhizome has been irrevocably altered by suicide since then, it still persists, and as this experience has shown, produced new advantageous growths. As Deleuze and Guattari write, quote, "A rhizome may be broken, shattered at a given spot, but it will start up again on one of its old lines or on new lines." Throughout his life, Deleuze fostered a number of intellectual connections and friendships. He maintained a rhizomatic relationship with Guattari, producing writings and intensities that maintained across space and time, life and death. In his essay For Felix, upon Guattari's death, Deleuze writes that the way to keep him alive is by following the open paths of creation in his works, discovering and rediscovering the singularities in his gestures. Upon his own death, those writing on Deleuze spoke of him and his activities as if he were still present, in line with his philosophical orientation towards the world. Dying by suicide is often preceded by periods of feeling hopeless or otherwise isolated. While the idea of external reterritorialization through deterritorialization may be one that is so hoped for and desired, the actuality of it is much more difficult to realize. Telling someone who feels suicidal to simply go out into the world and connect, virtually or in the flesh, comes across as a nearly impossible order. How does a suicidal subjectivity reconfigure itself, inventing new practices of interiority to combat external scripts and produce new lines of flight, even in isolation? Is it possible to reconcile persistent suicidality with liberatory thought in such a way that it does not culminate in the end of life, distinct from a life, which will be elaborated in the full version of this manuscript. The first step in answering the above questions involves acknowledging the ways in which contemporary power relations, especially those which operate through the institutions of psychoanalysis and modern psychiatry, actively work to redirect one's desiring machines, plugging them into appropriate channels for closing deviant lines of flight and offering therapies to aid the maladaptive psyche. Per Freud, for example, Western civilization has been hampering the desires of the unconscious since its inception, implementing taboos to mediate the dilemmas of collective life. As a relief, Freud turns to sublimation, a method of, quote, shifting the instinctual aims in such a way that they cannot come up against the frustration of the external world. However, this A, even by Freud's admission, offers only a mild intensity in return for its effort, and B, I argue, is an increasingly impossible task as desiring production operates on an infinite loop, and as many of the procedures of sublimation, such as art, musical creation, etc., have been co-opted by neoliberal logics, and the unconscious has become so mediated by the external digital world. Freud suggests that people may also turn to religion for its ability to produce a higher intensity of feeling in the face of the deadening instincts and neuroses. Freud asserts that a more thorough and energetic procedure than that of sublimation is the quote-unquote delusional remolding of reality to suit one's needs. When this is done on a mass scale, for Freud, it is religion. When it occurs on the individual level, it is pathological. Paranoia, psychosis, schizophrenia. When one's inner experiences and behavior deviates markedly from the expectations of the individual's culture, they may also be marked with a personality disorder. Even as some disorders like depression and anxiety are becoming more normalized, the aforementioned diagnoses, those which also have the highest risk of suicidality, along with any expressions of suicidality in general, remain highly stigmatized. And yet, it is to these conditions that Deleuze and Guattari turn to provide a model of existence that most contradicts capitalism and its accompanying power structures. Rather than returning the unconscious back to molar unities, Deleuze and Guattari embrace the multiplicities of the unconscious, and importantly, for my purposes here, they read a politics into these multiplicities that would otherwise be flattened by Freudian psychology and the liberal forms of its medicalization. Throughout the 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Deleuze and Guattari emphasize the 2 extremes, one deadening, one revolutionary for its intensity. Having already described the flattening effects of capitalism, in what remains, I touch upon the liberatory conception of schizophrenia provided by the authors, which is further extended in the full version of this paper, before meditating on some ways to access that intensity without going to the extreme, suggesting that such productions of intensity can help to alleviate feelings of suicidality, or at least serve to contextualize them more broadly within a life. Deleuze and Guattari argue that desire can be revolutionary. They argue that madness can produce something so wonderful that it must be repressed by our society, that lived experience is intensive, that one can experience an intensity, and such an intensity has no relationship to sensible qualities. That being said, the wonderful is also dangerous. Such intensity risks collapsing in on itself. To feel suicidal is to experience an intensity with risk. The opposite of a deadening, the feeling of suicidality is one predicated on the building of intensity to the point of destruction. The result is no longer being able to cope with the pure experience of life. And here, I note that in the full manuscript, this will include a note about the relationship between mania and suicide, as well as the common side effects that's often listed in antidepressant ads that they, quote unquote, may increase the risk of suicide in teenagers and young adults, because I think both of these 2 statistics highlight the extent to which the act of suicide itself is preceded by like a feeling of great intensity that our society doesn't offer like channels for. I argue that by opening ourselves up to such an understanding of suicide, while it may not tell us much about the death of Deleuze itself, it does offer a new mode of relating to those grappling with suicidality. Experiencing intensity is living. It is a part of life, and if it were recognized more so as such, we might, as Foucault suggests, see a decrease in the number of suicides because we wouldn't be so afraid of facing intensity. Those who are suicidal may not feel rushed into things, may find other avenues for release. While I intend to theorize more clearly what this may look like, and welcome feedback on this in particular, because I think it's what I struggle with the most. Like I can envision it, but then coming up with like a concrete thing of what that looks like is hard. I close with an excerpt from Immanence, a Life, the last essay that Deleuze wrote before his suicide. He writes, quote, "A life is the immanence of immanence, absolute immanence. It is complete power, complete bliss. A life is everywhere, in all the moments that a given living subject goes through that are measured by given living objects. An immanent life carrying with it the events or singularities that are merely actualized as subjects and objects. I find this refrain comforting as it doesn't place too much importance on the extreme moments, but rather focuses on the in-between. And my continued goal for this project is to figure out how to articulate why this feels so comforting, to translate it in such a way that it's applicable to non-philosophers experiencing suicidality. And I would gratefully accept feedback and questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Well, do you have any questions?
Yeah, hi. Hola, ¿se me escucha? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Hi. Hello. Thank you, Alison, for your presentation. I really liked it. And I'm quite, I feel the proximity between your the theory you're dealing with, because I've been reading Tikkun and the Invisible Committee. I come from the Deleuze and Guattari readings as well. So while I was listening, I had a question in my head, and I was thinking that maybe when you were telling something like getting back to the, I feel like you were saying something like getting back to the symptom, like retrieving your symptom, like getting into it. Do you think that in some point psychoanalysis and psychology flattens that kind of relationship with own symptom, and then they reconnected with the machinery desires of capitalism, or the subjectivity that neoliberal ideologies portray in our society? What kind of solution? Because I didn't have the line of flight.
I was thinking about that too.
Yeah, you were thinking of something
Yeah.
like schizoanalysis, maybe a kind of a solution, because I read Peter Papelbert had that kind of a way where we can just dramatize or theatralize our own inner other with the big A, and try to not deconstruct, but to deal with our neuroses and on our own potency, instead of being close to these comings and goings between omnipotence and impotence. Like, I have to be the best, I have to be the one who exploits himself the best, I have to be the one who is the I don't know, a demigod or something like that, and then feeling quite as well pretty shame about yourself because you didn't get to it, right? You stuck in there, and you don't recognize yourself as a mere life, right? Mere potence. So while you were saying something like trying to walk through the lines of flight and experiencing those suicidal thoughts and stuff like that, I was thinking that maybe that's a way to start, as you said, like a way to start of thinking of our own potency, or the way of we can create new forms of life, which can make ourselves a new forms of organization and deorganization and territorialization and deterritorialization in this kind of every time movement. And I don't know. It's a semi thought and semi questioning I have for you. So yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that, like, I wish I had the solution.
No.
I mean,
Yeah.
and I think that's so. Like, for Deleuze and Guattari, they offer, right, the return to the body without organs as a way of sort of like stripping oneself of the external scripts, flaying oneself open to receive just pure sensation.
Mhm.
But then they offer like masochism as a way of achieving that, which fine, but is not going to be very popular in society.
Yeah. I
And
thought
there are
you
some,
about Bataille's The Story of the Eye, and that kind of line of exploring oneself, one body without organs, the same way he was trying to do so in Acephal and stuff like that. But yeah, sorry.
and
Sorry.
then, yeah, of course. And then in the other two, so there are two pieces that I use in my other work to think through this. And one is a musical called The Elementary Space-Time Show by Cesar Alvarez, which I argue is a literal dramatization of the schizoanalysis. A
Okay.
teenage girl kills herself,
Mhm.
finds herself in a game show, and if she wants to die, she has to win.
Mhm.
And no one's telling her like you can or can't die. She just has to just go through this whole process of sitting with being dead and wanting to die, and its intensity. And then I also was thinking about this in one of the earlier presentations, where we were talking about the choice of suicide and how there's often it's conceived of as not having a choice, but that reason is because we don't give enough space for that choice to be articulated. So Foucault offers in the same essay, The Simplest Pleasures, a suicide hotel, where you go and you have all the time in the world to just think it through until he says the moment hits you with a moment of pure, simple pleasure. And he doesn't articulate whether that's the pleasure of finally deciding to kill yourself, or that the pleasure is like a redirection of the intensity. So you go on to live. But it is a liminal space of just sitting with. And I think that we just don't have those spaces. And the psychiatric hospital is not that space. The goal of the psychiatric hospital is to flatten symptoms again. So I mean, I think that the solution is to have this space for whether we call it schizoanalysis or whether we just call it like sitting with the intensity of suicidality, is important. Because and I work with young people today, and like they talk about wanting to die. Like they are very open about it. They're open about why, they know why, and then like no one listens. So it's like frustrating, to just be like, no, we need to acknowledge that this is a real feeling that people have, and like it can exist as part of life. And that maybe if we acknowledged suicidality as part of life, it wouldn't so often culminate with death.
Okay. So you think it's like being a two things: a taboo, like talking about death or suicide and stuff like that. That's why we are doing this conference as well, I think. And the second part is that I'm thinking like there's a not only not listening, but evading, trying to deal with that heavy certitude we have when we are on that intensity point where we have the suicidal thoughts, because there's no, as you said, there's no place to think about anything else. Like we don't have any the other ones, like Robin and Miriam, they talk about something like a loss, right? When we have no opportunity to choose and stuff like that, because we are already chosen, right, on that place. We choose that certitude in some way, right? So I'm thinking that we lose as well the capability of the unknown, right? We lose the, for example, like we see in Lovecraft writings, we see there's always an unknown presence, and in a cosmos, a big one, right? A big monsters and and chaotic things that we cannot grasp with our knowledge or um, with our conditions of possibility, right? So yeah, in some way, um, the trying to cope with these suicidal thoughts is having a space to deal with that. I think it's a good idea, right? And instead of putting us just pills or a regular or isometric way of therapeutic treatment, just to reconnect with the whole of society. It's a just not a way to get back to our roots, to what we are, to what we with the potencies we have within us, and to create new life, to bring life to outside, right? So yeah, it's huge. It's huge because it takes a lot of work to try to create a space like that and think about durations and longitudes and how can we build these kind of places and stuff like that. But yeah, I thank you so much. I'm gonna
Thanks.
I'm gonna let you finish and yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it does feel like a huge project, especially in the sense that, I mean, we often find that, I mean, especially in the literature of like physician-assisted death, they make it very clear that a physician-assisted death, euthanasia, is not suicide. Like the literature on that is all the activist work, at least in the United States, very much frames it as this is not suicide. This is the ending of a life because of a terminal illness. And I think there's this sense that like to be and in liberal societies, right, that to make a choice requires some degree of like rationality and some degree of like wholeness. But if we take Deleuze and Guattari's approach to suicidality, right, there is no wholeness in ourselves. All of ourselves are multiple, connected to various other objects and subjects. And any moments of wholeness would be liminal, like passing through them. And then it sort of stigmatizes any suicide that's not, if we can't trace a reason for it, then we're just like, oh, like that was pathological or something else. So yeah, which I think goes back to the whole agency question from the beginning of, because a question that I get asked a lot in my work is like, what about people who are like actually mentally ill? But what does that mean in this context?
Yeah, at some points as well, in psychoanalysis in the clinic, we often receive people who have a psychotic psyche, as we call it. I don't know, but then through the analysis they became sometimes neurotic, sometimes schizo, sometimes like it's like multiple phases, multiple variations of one's personality. So it's a different way of coping with one's symptom. That's I think it's a really way to put it, because we are like a multiplicity all the time, and sometimes it just closes up, and then just the I don't know, what he talks about, the fascist line of death, right? Like the death drive, and trying to explore that, but with prudence, right? They call it's always, they makes a call to prudence. Try to, if I and take the measures, right? If I'm going to drink, if I'm going to take the pills, or if I'm going to be suicidal, I'm going to be like for 40 minutes. Or if I'm going to drink this, I'm going to take just only 3 bottles or less, and then try to experience that kind of feeling. Like Bukowski at some point tried that kind of feeling. It was like kind of as well a body with their organs through all that history he describes and stuff like that. But anyway, yeah. I was trying to finish before, but yeah. The conversation can continue. And
thank you both so very much for such an inspiring dialogue. This is what I want to see after each presentation, please.
And I would then introduce, as just mentioned by Josefa, the continuation of the Deleuze panel, and would like to introduce the final speaker also for today's conference day, Mercedes López Mateo, and her presentation, The Fall of a Legend, Deleuze's Suicide and his Spinoza. Mercedes has graduated in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Four Universities Alliance with the Erasmus Plus scholarship. She has undertaken exchanges with the Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne, where she specialized in phenomenology. She has published academic articles on the relationship between phenomenology and medicine in Bajo Palabra and Ercritia. And she's also worked and collaborates assiduously on the philosophical website Philosophia and Co. Mercedes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. And of course, thank you to Josefa for the opportunity to take part in this fantastic Congress. Today, I will discuss Deleuze's suicide and how paradoxical it may or may not be in relation to his Spinozist vitalism. Gilles Deleuze commits suicide in November 1995 at the age of 70 by throwing himself out of the window of his apartment in Paris. By the time of his death, he had severe respiratory problems and needed an oxygen tank to breathe. Despite the exhausting effort he had to make in those last years to accomplish any daily activity, Deleuze was always recognized as a strong vitalist philosopher and a scholar of the vitalist tradition of thought. To mention the most significant of his studies, Bergson, Nietzsche, and Spinoza. About the latter, whom he called with affection the prince of philosophers, he once said, "He, more than any other, gave me the feeling of a gust or air fresh pushing you from behind every time you read him." Thanks to Deleuze, the reading and study of Spinoza are refreshed after centuries of systematic neglect. Deleuze succeeds in popularizing the image of Spinoza as the philosopher of life and joy. Moreover, Deleuze shared with Spinoza his position about life. For Spinoza, life is not an idea or something theoretical, it's a manner of being, the same eternal manner in all of its aspects. As I will explain in my intervention, he was also aware of his position on suicide as an impossibility due to its self-destructive nature. Hence, the question that concerns us in this session is the following. How can this be consistent with Deleuze's suicide? Some prior disclaimers about the methodology and the object of research that defines the course of this Congress will be necessary first. Each of us has chosen a contemporary author who will have committed suicide in order to seek in his work the correlation that we already know to exist, a will to die that emerges in writing. Besides the problem of having the answer to a research question before doing the actual research, there is also the imminent danger of rushing into the fallacy commonly known as cherry picking. As you may already know, this is one of the simplest dangers in research, especially in social science, since it involves the partial selection of those cases, in our exercise, those texts or citations, that confirms our hypothesis, stressing them while completely ignoring the evidence that may contradict us. With this in mind, it seems important to me not only to take into consideration the citation that could reveal an approach to suicide, but also the author's thought as a whole. Knowing the way in which his thought operates will make it easier for us to adjust the general question of the Congress to the specific case of study, especially when we are dealing with a philosopher as unique as Deleuze. Firstly, it will be legitimate to wonder, when the texts we are addressing are philosophical treatises, do they communicate the truth of the writer in the same way as literature does? Should the methodology be the same when our subject of study is a philosopher, a poet, or a novelist? It is widely known that Deleuze deeply rejected media events. What he rejected in these encounters was the exercise of interrogating the author as a differentiated element of his work, as if a different truth that the writing one would arise through this dialogue. Nevertheless, as René Scherrer will say about his friends and colleague at the Université de Vincennes, the truth of a man is in the written. In Deleuze's case, the whole of himself is in his books. And yet, and this is essential for our thesis, this whole must not be interpreted in an essentialist way. It is Deleuze we are talking about, and to think in such terms will be an absolute contradiction. In Critical and Clinical, Deleuze claims that writing is inseparable from becoming. Writing brings out combination and possibilities that in ordinary language slip through our fingers due to massive formations. That is why, for Deleuze, it's in the writer who must be listened to, because it is through his exercise that he's able to access life and its singularities and anxieties. Deleuze's thinking and writing overcome unitary, heavy identities to make way for events. This becomes a problem for the purpose of our conference. Not only do we find ourselves facing the problem I mentioned before, since we are tracing an answer we already know and want to discover, but we are also applying the rules of a detective game to an author who cannot be trapped by any kind of pre-established rule. With Deleuze, given guidelines are useless because sense is being constructed constantly in its pure becoming. We see this in the logic of sense in the 10th series entitled Of the Ideal Game. Deleuze uses the example of Lewis Carroll's Alice to describe this type of games that we do not fully understand because they don't have specific rules, nor winners or losers. With astonishing speed, they begin and end whenever they want to, like the croquet match in which the mullets are pink flamingos. In these ideal games, there are no pre-existing rules. Its movement invents its own rule. It bears upon its own rule. As opposed to conventional games in which chance is already pre-established, fixed at certain specific moments, like the moment of roulette or dice. As opposed to this, he proposed imagining pure games that spread out chance at its moment, assigning singularities without a fixed sense. Why do I mention this example? Because the same happens with Deleuze's thought, which is the best example of this ideal game, impossible to be controlled by pre-existing rules. Thus, should we reformulate the rule question of this conference for the specific case of Deleuze? Can we even look for rules in his thought that would allow us to establish the logical correlation wanted between his text and his suicide if everything is full of open events and possibilities? I will go very quickly through this point in case anyone here is not familiar with Deleuze's philosophy. What should we understand by event? We could dedicate an entire congress to this concept in Deleuze, but let's recall what is interesting for the hypothesis of our seminar. And here I quote Deleuze in Negotiations. There are various ways of looking at concepts. For ages, people have used them to determine what something is, its essence. We, though, are interested in the circumstances in which things happen. In what situation, where, and when does a particular thing happen? How does it happen? And so on. A concept, as we see it, should express an event rather than an essence. Thus, when we speak of an event, we refer to a fluctuating composition which is in constant change without begin or end, and not to a fixed essence. And this, of course, we must also apply to the question of the suicidal character of Deleuze himself and of his test. Wondering whether Deleuze's writings contain this essence would certainly be to miss the point of his own philosophy. If so, the right question to ask is, under what conditions was Deleuze's suicide possible? Moreover, if the plurality of the event is always an open and dynamic system that generates new, unpredictable, unexpected lines, can we even look for indication that his suicide might one day in the future take place? In Deleuze's words, there is no general prescription. We have done with all globalizing concepts. Even concepts are haixeities, events. In any case, and keeping this Deleuzean background in mind, let us return to the initial question. Was there any possibility of predicting the event of Deleuze's suicide by reading his book? Could suicide be expected from the philosopher of vitalism? Does it make sense that the one who renewed Spinoza would eventually commit the most impossible act for him, that is, suicide? Of course, Deleuze was aware, as I said before, that suicide was impossible for Spinoza. And in his lecture on Spinoza in 1981, he said, even any action is good insofar as it expresses a power of action, puissance. The power of action of your body, whether it is good in this sense, unless you launch into an action which destroys the relation of your body, that is, into a suicidal action. But to the extent that it expresses a power of action in your body, it is good. Here, Deleuze is referring to Spinoza's Ethics, to the fourth book, Proposition 20, where it is said, no one, as said, refuses food or kills himself from a necessity of his nature, but only when forced by external causes. It is impossible that a man, from the necessity of his nature, should endeavor not to exist. It is essential, for the sake of my argument, to understand that both Deleuze and his master, for both of them, there is no such thing as a death drive. This is certainly not incompatible with being able to trace signs of his future suicide, but in no case provoked by a sort of death drive in the purest psychoanalytic sense. During the month following Deleuze's suicide, many of his colleagues paid tribute to him in newspapers such as Libération. There, they tried to figure out the cryptic meaning of their friend's death, because it had to have a meaning. In this regard, I owe thanks to a wonderful compilation work by André-Pierre Colombat entitled November 4th, 1995, Deleuze's Death as an Event, for the precise collection of all these hypotheses that were proposed then. Accordingly, I consider two ways to justify the paradox that indeed Deleuze agreed with Spinoza's assumptions about the impossibility of suicide, while at the same time his texts were open to the possibility of the suicide of the author. First of all, his terrible health condition turned out to be completely disabling for any task of his daily life, for the development of his possibilities. As much as the power of body is life, as much as the proper of the being is self-preservation, Deleuze's body was not capable of bearing anything else. That limit towards which the conatus tends had come to an end for him. The perseverance of his being was exhausted. His aged body was deteriorated by tuberculosis, the lack of a lung, his asthma crisis, and his complete dependence on an oxygen tank. Deleuze dedicates one of his lectures of 1981 to the relation between the typologies of illness and suicide from Spinoza's point of view. Speaking of internal disease in which an organism gradually stops working, he brings up these words of Spinoza in this column of Proposition 39, also in Book 4. No reason compels me to maintain that the body does not die unless it is changed into a corpse. And indeed, experience seems to urge a different conclusion. Sometimes a man undergoes such changes that I should hardly have said he was the same man. The letter Deleuze wrote to Noël Châtelet 2 weeks before committing suicide will confirm this theory. Noël was the widow of his Vincent classmate, François Châtelet. According to her, it was written in trembling and with difficulty. He wrote me to tell that he didn't want to live through what François had lived through. Deleuze was already noticing that his ability to work, to read, and in general to develop the potential that a life deserves was falling apart, and he did not want to attend to this suffering and absolute deterioration. In conclusion, we are facing a body that was barely alive, even with artificial external help, but whose power was completely consumed, so he could not stand it any longer. Secondly, there is another way of justifying the coherence or predictability of Deleuze's suicide regarding his work and thought, although, as we will see, both are related and will eventually converge. Now, we will not consider his suicide from the point of view of biological fatigue, but as the last and most extreme vitalist act. It is well known that both Deleuze and Guattari constantly encourage experimentation through the body. They push the Spinozist question to its limit. What is a body capable of? What effects are you capable of? However, they also insisted on the need for prudence in order to make desire ludic and lucid. We see this, for example, in his dialogues in the text on Spinoza. Experiment, but you need a lot of prudence to experiment. Side effects are all those which reduce our power to act. He mentioned again the same danger in the recording of his abécédaire in D as in Desire, only 7 years before committing suicide. And he said, I can stand it, especially young people. I can stand a young person cracking up. It's just unbearable. However, he continues speaking, making indeed a great revelation here. He said, an old man who cracks up, who commits suicide even, he at least has already lived his life. But a young person who cracks up out of stupidity, well, we find here a vindication of action. It is a vindication of experimentation, even with those bad encounters that can destroy a part of us. Tightening the limits of what is a body capable of also implies tinkering, playing around with those things that can reduce our power, such as alcohol or drugs even, but always doing so with caution. Always, here we can already appreciate the research question of this Congress applied to Deleuze. That essential detail we point out, that the question is not suicide, yes or not, but under what conditions. If we refer to suicide when someone has already exhausted the potential of his life, it does not seem to worry Deleuze too much. There is one last text where his vitalism shows some room for suicide. This text, furthermore, brings us back to the question of the event where we began this ideal game of thought. It is the 22nd series of The Logic of Sense, entitled Porcelain and Volcano. There, Deleuze subscribes to Blanchot's reading on death. And I quote, death as event, inseparable from the past and future into which it is divided, never present, an impersonal death, the ungraspable, that which I cannot grasp, for it is not bound to me by any sort of relation, which never comes and toward which I do not go, and the personal death, which occurs and is actualized in the most harsh present, whose extreme horizon is the freedom to die and to be able to risk oneself mortally. In this work, suicide is shown as the wish to bring about the coincidence of the two phases of death. Suicide removes death as a future. It is individual determination that extracts death from the future place to bring it back to the event of the current moment. Thus, the impersonal death is compromising a personal death. In Deleuze's words, in dialogue, the anxiety of the death, which is no longer that of a person, but the extraction of a pure event and its own time, on its own play. To conclude, none of these fragments that we have been pointed out by themselves will explain the paradoxical phenomenon that was the suicide of the greatest vitalist of the 20th century. Just as no single essence gives shape to what we read as a subject, but rather exists a rhizomatic structure with a multitude of lines of flight and singularities, so we must congregate Deleuze's text to understand and perhaps anticipate this event. Obviously, we know that for Spinoza, in no case will be acceptable to assume that someone would want to commit suicide from the necessity of his own nature. However, although Deleuze inherits this tradition, he also does so from Stoicism. Therefore, we do not speak of a desire to die, but we do speak of a desire to live the right sort of life. To understand the event of his suicide in relation to his philosophy, we must not lose sight of the most simple and obvious, and here I quote Scherer, Deleuze's entire philosophy is a hymn to life, an affirmation of life. Philosophy and life are inseparable in Deleuze, and he makes this explicit from Nietzsche, who also greatly influenced him in Logic of Sense again. Nietzsche has at his disposal a method of his own invention. We should not be satisfied by either biography or bibliography. We must reach a secret point where the anecdote of life and the aphorism of thought amount to one and the same thing. The aphorism of life and the anecdote of thought. Deleuze himself immediately gives the suicide of Empedocles by throwing himself into the Etna, as you already know, of course. In both cases, despite their difference, we will find ourselves dealing with existential gestures that will reflect the essence of their thought. These are anecdotes that are congruent with their philosophical corpus until the greatest of extremes, until the worst of encounters, death. In Deleuze, we find a stoic acceptance of the arrival of death, acceptance of the exhaustion of his power due to his illness and advanced age, and is precisely an acceptance moved by his love of life. The aphorism of life that Deleuze leaves us with his suicide is expressed by Busquets. It's the apotheosis of the will. Finally, however, I would like to pose the following questions to end. Does prediction mean the same as prevention? I shall elaborate on this. From what has been seen here today, we have established that Deleuze's suicide was predictable according to his aphorism of life. Someone could read his text today or 30 years ago before his death and say, I'm not surprised, I could have seen it coming. I have tried to illustrate how Deleuze defended a love life above anything else, but not at any cost, not just any life. Deleuze did not stop persevering in his being, and for that reason precisely, when it stopped being possible, he accepted the end of his self-preservation. To love life is perhaps the purest way to recognize when it must come to an end. We have not found in Deleuze a psychoanalytic death drive, but rather the stoic acceptance of a man who was already at the gates of natural death and who only wanted to preserve his agency and power until the last moment. Consequently, was there really a chance to prevent such suicide? How does the qualitative leap take place from the textual identification in our research to actual preservation? I would like to conclude my argument with these words that Deleuze dedicates to the Stoics. So that agents or patients, when we act or undergo, we must always be worthy of what happens to us. Stoic morality is undoubtedly this, not being inferior to the event, a love of life which can say yes to death. Thank you very much, and I will be pleased to answer any question that you have.
Yes, thank you too. And before I open the discussion, I would also take something up what Josefa wrote when your presentation started and want to congratulate you for your freshly earned MA degree. Yeah, thank you again. And the presentation is open for discussion. Yes, Juan. has a
Yeah.
question.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Hi. Hello. Hello again. Thank you, Maria, for the presentation. I really like it. And I was thinking while you were exposing the case of Deleuze about Michestete as well. I'm going to present it tomorrow, and I was thinking that when you talk about the death of the author and these things, I was thinking about the pseudonyms that he uses, the characters that he always tries to um, um, mm, use them as a character, use the character to explore different spaces of life. It's like using the character to uh, uh, try to elaborate through a line of light and taking that till death, till the death of the author, which is at the same time a character. And I was thinking that because it came to my mind Emile Cioran, who also said something like suicide as a vital project of life, and that gives strength as well to the writer to explore what the character has to offer to the body as well, to experience new realities and put suicide as something like um, uh, a change of character, not at the end of everything, but to keep that potency, that multiplicity that we are, and not try to just close it just to a one character. That's what I think depression is like usually, because when usually when we see in the clinic is that depressive subject is someone who keeps on doing the same habitat, and then in the clinic they change that to they change the habitus to an habitat. They explore their own character, and they see the flaws, they see the bad choices and everything that keeps on how do you say, the um, um, uh, just how do you say it, like close character, right? And then the transition is to change to another character who fits more perfectly with the multiplicity or the potency that he has. And I was thinking to ask you, what do you think about the author of the dead, if he's talking about this change of masks, or if he's or change of character, or he's talking about something different, like about himself, like when he decided to jump off the window, when he decided to put an end to his life because it was hard for him. Like Emile Cioran says as well, the body uh, diminish the potency of the thought as well. So yeah, I don't know if you understand my question, but yeah.
Yes. Well, I think so.
Thank
I'm
you.
not an expert in I'm not an expert in the list, but well, I think that this potency that you were talking about, this death idea, he has it in some character like Virginia Woolf, Fitzgerald. He talks about this in Logic of Sense, in his negotiations. He has in mind these bad encounters, but I think that, well, this is my interpretation at least. I think that he has this like a consequence, inevitable consequence, that he will have to deal with it when his power, his potency will end. But until that moment comes, I think he's focused in the potency, in the good encounters.
Try to like Spinoza's saying, right? That the perseverance of the being and stuff like that, right? Okay. Yep. Well, that's all. Thank you so much.
There is a question in the chat by Robin, which I'm going to read, if that's okay. One of Spinoza's controversial and not well understood views is that the human mind is eternal. I'm curious as to whether Deleuze might have held a similar view regarding a kind of immortality, albeit very atypical.
Well, really, I haven't read anything about this in Deleuze. I cannot say that Deleuze never say anything about mind, an eternal mind, but it doesn't seem to me like very Deleuzian. I don't know. Maybe Alison can say more about this.
Yes, she has her hand up.
So, yeah, I really liked the presentation because I also, when looking at the topic of the conference and thinking about Deleuze, I was like, well, there are no clues, and Deleuze would condemn this project in the first place. And so I think it's really interesting the fact that you sort of leave behind the question of like, is it consistent with Deleuze's work that so many people after his work was trying to answer, and thinking about instead the conditions of its possibility, because in the idea of like, could it have been predicted by looking for traces of suicidality in his work? Like, no. But does it make sense? Yes, in the broader sense that Deleuze didn't believe in any sort of sense except as it related to the irrationality. And I think in terms of the idea of immortality, I mean, I think in the sense that he was very concerned with the idea of rhizomatic thought and being able to form these vital connections with other people, and that they're part of the work, that if a part of the rhizome gets cut off, right, the rest of the rhizome still exists. So it exists in like a drastically altered form. But like Deleuze still exists with us, right? After Guattari's death, Deleuze still wrote on him as if he were present. So I think that in that sense, rather than looking at Deleuze's suicide as sort of like a climax, that it's just another avenue in the plateau of his like intensity throughout his life. So it's not a sense of like immortality, but rather a sense of like just a transformed creative flow that's still going, but ebbing, flowing, and existing in his works and his conversations, which is comforting in a sense. But yeah, I think I sort of have a question for you, and that one of the things that my work tries to do is to specifically look at the conditions of life and power that Deleuze describes, and then think about how his work and his philosophies can be sort of comfort to a suicidal subject. And I'm thinking especially today in this era of hypermedia, where really sort of vitality and intensities have been flattened, right? You plug into something, you're on your phone, like algorithms are feeding you things, and there's less of a sense of vitality and intensity. And just thinking about Deleuze and how he might offer some mitigations for that, like how to create new intensities and vitalities in light of a flattened sociality.
It's really a very good question. I like it a lot. Maybe for Deleuze, these social media and so on, it could be even another sort of bad encounters. And he maybe will tell us, experiment with them, use them, play with them, take your self-care about them, not throwing yourself, not consuming you in them, but enjoy. I don't know, maybe it's another drug.
I think it's the same, because I feel like it's already been co-opted. Like, it had its moment of playfulness, and now it's just been siphoned off into something else that I think he would be less excited about.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe that's a conception of time very lineal, very chronological, and maybe he will say something about the event, the kairos, about the social media who is still to come. I don't know.